Our next speaker is well known to anybody with MS, particularly anybody with MS in Victoria, and that's Helmut Butzkueven. Helmut has a list of positions as long as your arm, but two of the most impressive and important are Head of Neuroscience at Monash University and Foundation Director of Neurology at Alfred Health. We've been very fortunate to have had Helmut come and speak to us a few times in the past. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Helmut this morning, and I'm quite sure he'll have something surprising to tell us. I'm hopeful he has something surprising to tell us. I well remember a session when he came and talked about how mobile phone technology was changing research for progressive MS because of its ability to measure small changes in physical ability, etc. So please join with me in welcoming Helmut.
Thank you for asking me to talk again, Nigel. I was given a brief to talk about new treatments in MS, so what might be coming, and I'll do that, and I'll put it into a bit of context. But the first 10 minutes of the talk is going to be a bit self-indulgent, maybe not that good, and then we'll build it up. So what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the basic science, where we're going, and briefly talk about vitamin D and also EBV, because EBV is the hot thing that everybody wants to know about. And also about this question, which might apply to some of you. I hear that from time to time. You know, why am I getting worse if my scan doesn't show any new lesions? Not everyone's getting worse, of course, but this is something that some people who are getting worse are wondering, and I think we're getting closer to the answer. And then I'll talk about some of the new treatments that are coming up. So the first thing is vitamin D. How many of you take a vitamin D supplement? So MS Australia, many years ago now, funded a trial in very early MS to see whether this actually helps with inflammation. And the reason for that was obvious if you Google it. This is actually old slides, so I recycled these slides from my last talk, and then I'll give you like the update. This is even a few years ago, it's probably more now, but if you Google vitamin D and MS, you get 9.87 million website hits. So it's, you know, popular. And we set out to ask the question, how much to take, and does it work for inflammation in MS? And the reason for doing that is that there was lots of lines of evidence that somehow suggest sunlight, which makes vitamin D in the skin, is important in the cause of MS. You know, as people living in Victoria, you've all, well, have MS or loved ones with MS. If you lived your lives in Townsville, up there in tropical North Queensland, this room would literally be 7 times smaller, like 6 out of 7 of you would have never gotten MS. Right? It's much, much less common. And if you lived your lives in Newcastle, it'll be half of you. In Brisbane, 4 times less. So this is a very old graph that just shows the prevalence of MS in different parts of Australia, and as we're getting closer to the equator and closer to Papua New Guinea, you can see how those numbers get smaller. This is another study that's had lots of funding that's actually run out of Hobart, and it was it's a cohort of people many years ago that were newly diagnosed with MS, and was looking at the instance of that, and it kind of shows you what I was talking about, how in Tasmania it was more than in Geelong, it was more than in Newcastle, it was much more than in Brisbane. And sorry. Oh, it's a bit stuck now. I think I might need your help, Nigel, sorry. Could you advance the slide? And when they looked at people who were just newly diagnosed with MS, and they took other people as a control from the same community, the higher the vitamin D level, the less likely people were to be diagnosed with MS, which is what this graph also shows. So there was kind of a lot of evidence to suggest that vitamin D and sunlight is somehow involved in MS. Oh, it's going to be a bit painful for you, Nigel. I'm
That's
sorry.
all right. That's all right. You can be that now.
So it's the idea of getting more vitamin D. So what we set out to do, with lots of support from the MS Society, from MS Australia, is to do a trial. So maybe if we can. I'm wondering if could we turn the computer around?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to make it very difficult for the camera person too. Oh yeah. And you might say, well, Australia, we got lots of sunlight, so surely we don't need to take any more vitamin D. And that's actually the winter picture of sunlight in the world. And this is the Australian summer. And sure enough, in the Australian summer, you know how that's all yellow or orange. We get, and a little bit green, we get actually plenty of sunlight. And you can't get sunburned in Europe anywhere at all, or even in North Africa in their winter. But in our winter, actually the southern half, you know, like Melbourne where we are down here, doesn't get enough sun to burn the skin. So I guess there was lots of good reasons to do this trial. The reason why we wanted to sort it out is there's actually two possibilities of how the sunlight might work. One of them might be through vitamin D. So the sun makes vitamin D in the skin, that somehow is anti-inflammatory. It reduces the amount of inflammation in the brain. Or the sunlight does something else. The problem is that, so if that's true, then taking more vitamin D should also work, right? So vitamin D could be a treatment for reducing inflammation of MS. But if this is true, then taking vitamin D won't work, because the sun is doing something else. But the tricky thing is that, you know, I told you that if you've got a lower vitamin D level, you're more likely to be diagnosed with MS at that point. But the tricky thing is that this can just be a marker of the amount of sunlight that you're exposed to. So you're measuring vitamin D level. If you're not taking vitamin D, if you're just out in the sun, it tells you how much sun exposure you've had. So even if the effect is actually this way, it's still going to be associated with your blood vitamin D level, because that also measures how much sun you've had. Does that make sense? So the only way to sort that out is to actually do a trial and give people vitamin D. So that's what we did. So actually people were given either 1,000, 5,000 or 10,000 units of vitamin D after they had their first attack of MS. and or actually placebo, nothing. And this is so old that it's really before everything became electronic. So that's the study coordinator, Julianne, who actually putting in the ethics application at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in 27 copies. So that killed a whole tree. 7 years later, let's just say it took a long time to do it, but we did it. That's me at the start and at the end. So it is done, and we definitely showed that if you give people vitamin D up to 10,000 units, you make their vitamin D level much, much higher in the blood. So you can see people were taking 10,000 units, they were getting up to 200 in their blood levels, and it was actually perfectly safe to do. But this is the headline result, which is the number of people who over the next year actually developed MS, and it didn't do anything. So we had 54% of the people in the placebo group developing new lesions or relapses, 51% in the 1,000, 65% in the 5,000, 63% in the 10,000. So the vitamin D, while it's really good for your bones and you shouldn't be vitamin D deficient, the high doses didn't do anything. So that's the sad part of the story, 10 years of my life. Vitamin D did not reduce multiple sclerosis disease activity after clinically isolated syndrome. So it didn't work. Must be something else. Yes?
I've got a question. I understand the research will focus on MS, but the vitamin D as a vitamin D itself is involved in our body in more than 3,300 processes.
Sure.
And maybe actually the other processes which vitamin D is involved help reduce, and maybe we don't know that one probably.
I think the sunlight does lots and lots of other things to the immune system as well. We know that somehow the sun is the most likely thing to be involved, but we just don't know how it works, and it doesn't seem to work for vitamin D. I'm not saying vitamin D is bad, it just doesn't work for reducing inflammation in MS.
So should we still continue taking vitamin D supplements?
Look, I advise my patients to take 1,000 or 2,000 units a day, because that'll keep people, their bone, like it'll keep their blood level at a point where their bones are safe.
What level do you try to say? 200 club or below?
No, like somewhere around 80 to 100, something like that is good.
I thought if you went over a certain level with your vitamin D level, it's not safe. They do a blood test.
There's a very slow increase in the risk of, I like this, it's like a chat. There's a very slow increase in the risk of, a small increase in the risk of heart disease actually, and stroke in very, very high levels, but probably only in some people who develop a slightly high calcium level. So it may be very slightly unsafe to take really high doses, but in that sort of range of 80 to 120, you're going to be fine. Just don't take mega doses, probably.
I did mega doses, so I'm still in the 200 club, even though I'm down to 3,000 a day. I used to do 10,000 for a long time, but after 9 years, my calcium still is okay. So that's the other test to have you got to do.
So 2,000, 3,000 units is fine. Just don't take 10 or 20,000, I don't think. I might keep going for a bit, and then we can. So lots of people are interested in EBV, because much work suggests now that EBV uninfected people is actually quite rare. So at least 90% of us or more have EBV, right? So it's not like an uncommon disease, and it's part of the herpes viruses. So it stays in your body like other herpes viruses. So shingles, cold sores. So these herpes viruses, the body can never get rid of them completely. So how did they link EBV infection to MS, given that 90% of people or more have it? And they did that a couple of times, and very importantly, again quite recently, with US Army recruits. So up to 1 million people a year join the US Army, and they all have blood tests. And then they have blood tests every year, and those blood tests are to check for hepatitis B or AIDS, you know. And some very clever people stored those blood tests. So these are all like 18, 19, 20-year-olds, basic mostly. And they actually, in the study, they didn't look at the people who already had EBV, but you could measure who didn't. So they could find, you know, the 10% of people who were 18 or 19 who didn't have any antibodies to EBV, who had never been infected with EBV before. And then, just those 10%, which is still a lot of people, they saw who, during the next 10 or 15 years of their army career, actually got MS. And then they went back to the blood test and they showed that in every single case, those people developed glandular fever or an EBV infection, and they became positive for EBV at some point before they got MS. And that wasn't the case for other viruses, so basically you have to have EBV in your body to get MS. Of course, most people who have EBV in their body don't get MS. But it was that study that really clinched it for us, that this is a really important element somehow of getting MS, and might be one of the keys to the cure one day. But the role of EBV beyond that, so we know that EBV can live in the nervous system. It'll sometimes become active and start replicating, and then it will become dormant again. But we have no idea whether after you have MS, this is actually important at all. Like whether it does something to the MS after it helps cause it. So some of the things that it might be doing is promote MS relapses, MS progression, or even MS fatigue. Some of you probably have sometimes quite bad fatigue, and in many people that's sort of somewhat fluctuating. It's not always present at the same level, and there's an idea that maybe more virus replication might drive that, and we don't know. So one of the things which is coming are 2 trials that MS Australia is leading. One of them is a short-term trial to see if an EBV medication in people with MS can reduce fatigue. So if you have really high fatigue, you would go on this, you know, for about 8 weeks, I think. Either that or placebo to see whether the drug actually reduces your fatigue. And the second one is a longer trial in progressive MS to see if the EBV medication can reduce MS progression. So it will be alongside whatever else someone is taking, and these trials will be done in several sites in Victoria, and I'm sure the MS Australia website will tell you where you might be able to participate in those if you want to. This year though. So that's good. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about this question, which I get a lot from people with MS. And to be honest, I was doing quite a lot of hand waving for a long time. I didn't really know how to answer that. We know it happens. We know that some people can get worse in some part of their body without new disease activity, without new lesions or relapses. So how does that work? And we call that progressive MS. But some of it, I think, is now explainable. And in a way, it's actually also quite good news. So there are these things called pearls and cells. And some of you have pearls and cells. And these terms relate to what can happen in an existing lesion. You have a lesion in your brain or your spine. And a PERL stands for paramagnetic rim lesion. So the rim is the edge, and paramagnetic here refers to iron, actually. So this is another way of saying some lesions seem to have a ring of iron around them. And you need specialized sequences on MRI scans to see it. But they're looking at this lesion here with this special sequence. And can you kind of see how it's got a white, well, the red arrows point, but it's got like a white kind of ring around it. And that's a PERL, so-called paramagnetic rim lesion. Very, very specific for MS. You don't actually see this like in strokes or, this is an, and what is that? It's kind of quite closely related to this second thing called a cell, which stands for slowly expanding lesion. So some lesions that have this iron rim around them also get slowly bigger. And they get slowly bigger, by slowly I mean literally over many years. And it's very, very hard to see on routine scans. But here's, for example, a person who's been monitored for 20 years with their MS. And the lesion starts off as a tiny lesion. And at the age of 40, it's that size, 45, it's that size, 55, it's that size. So you can see how it's very slowly and gradually getting bigger. So this is still very hard to see for, radiologists in clinical practice. It's also very hard to see over the course of a year, because what you're seeing there is actually over 20 years. So probably need to go back to scans from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago to actually see it. But this is one of the explanations why people can get worse and there's no new lesions. It's because these lesions are somehow active. And the idea of how that works is that you have just kind of a schematic focusing on the cells that the iron is actually in, but this is meant to be an acute lesion. So there's a blood vessel, usually in the middle of it, and there's lots of immune cells that come out and cause the myelin damage, and then they leave, and some of those lesions are completely repaired, but some of them have this iron rim, and if you look at people who have that and who've died, look at their lesions under the microscope, it's often a different kind of inflammatory cell called a microglial cell, which is sitting around the outside here. And the idea is that this is somehow still doing damage. So the PERL, the iron, is mostly probably detecting lesions where you still have these immune cells sitting on the outside. And I guess the best way to think about it is that they are maybe slowly eating away. So not violently and quickly, like that, but they're still slowly eating away at the brain, at the spinal cord. And I think this makes sense. And lots of studies are now looking at these. It also provides us something that we didn't have before. Oh, this is actually, sorry, just to show you that not every lesion does this. So this is, I think it was something like 4,000 scans analyzed. So the numbers of lesions, the average number of lesions that people with MS with these scans had was 23, and 2 of them were slowly expanding. So like 90% are not. It's only a few lesions that do this. So this is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it's like an actual explanation as to why some people with MS might get worse. And secondly, it's a treatment target. Right? The current treatments are not getting into the brain very well. And if we measure people and they have perimagnetic rim lesions or they have cells, and we give a treatment, we could see whether that goes away or stops. In clinical trials, we call that a biomarker, because we could do this to just with a few people, 10 or 20 or 30 people, try a medication and see if after a year, 6 months, scan them every month or every 6 months or every 3 months, and we could see if the treatment can stop that from happening. Does it turn the cell into a no longer expanding lesion? That's what we've been searching for a long time. It's a way of measuring progression quickly in order to try lots more drugs. So some of the things which I guess are riffing on that, which are coming now, is there's a treatment called Ocrevus or ocrelizumab. Some of you may be on it. An infusion medication every 6 months, and in primary progressive MS, so in progressive MS, it's one of the medications that has been proven to work a bit. And this is the clinical trial which was done many years ago, called OPERA. They often have fancy names. They have whole companies that try and work out how to make an acronym sound good. So this was called OPERA. And so people were either taking placebo or sugar water infusions, salt water infusions, I guess, or the active drug. And this is the rate of progression or worsening in the trial. And you can see that the blue line, the ocrelizumab line, people are still getting worse, right? But they're getting worse less fast than they are if they're just taking the placebo. And overall, over 4 years, that difference is about a quarter. So one of the questions is if this, if that works a bit, is more better? And the reason why it might be is not giving more ocrelizumab into the blood, but it's actually giving more ocrelizumab into the brain. Our brain, for very good reasons, is tightly protected from the blood. We have a thing called the blood-brain barrier, which means that lots of bugs and toxins, things can't get into the brain, and in general that's a good thing, right? Except if we want to actually deliver treatment, it's stopping us often. So if you're having an Ocrevus infusion and you're getting lots of antibody infused into your blood, only about 1% of that can get into the brain. So the obvious thing to do is in progressive MS to double that and see if you get a better effect. So that's exactly what's happened. That trial, double dose ocrelizumab in progressive MS, was not done in Australia, but it finished recruiting. This is from a US website. And it's going to read out, I think, in the first quarter of next year. So if this works better, next year some of you may be offered that.
Effect on vice versa as well. It lies worse as well.
Sorry?
The side effect of that more dose can be
Yeah.
worse as well. Yeah.
It's possible, but actually in the blood, it already works like 100%. Ocrevus targets a thing called a B cell, and B cells, if we try to measure B cells in the blood in people who are taking Ocrevus, we can't find any. So you're right, it's possible that double the dose will give double the side effects, but This is actually about trying to push more of this into the brain. This is the idea that's central to that double dose Ocrevus story and to the fact that Ocrevus can work a bit in progressive MS is that another player that's important in progressive MS worsening in the brain is the B cell. Because Ocrevus targets B cells. And there's another way of getting rid of B cells. Quite a dramatic way, shall we say. It's called a CAR T cell, and this has been invented recently for cancer. And it's very, very successful. Cancers of the immune system are called lymphomas and leukemias. You might have heard those words. So this is when immune cells go, just like other tissues of the body, they can go crazy and cause a cancer. And if chemotherapy doesn't work for you, this still might work. And what this diagram shows is actually that out of your own body are taken blood cells, and in fact T cells. So they, part of your own immune system called T cells, is taken out of the body. It's reprogrammed by a kind of gene therapy to kill your own B cells. It's then infused back into you, and these cells can go into the brain, they can go everywhere, and killing all the B cells. You will make more, you will make new ones in time, but it's hoping to really wipe all the B cells out. So this is also, a company called Novartis is about to launch these trials in MS, and one arm is in progressive MS. This is a slide, an illustration I found on the internet of how that actually works. So the red guy is one of your T cells that's now been reprogrammed to actually attack the B cell and kill it. So comes out of cancer, and we think these trials will start, including in Australia, next year. Another story that's happening, this one largely overseas, but coming, is about another molecule called Bruton's tyrosine kinase. So this guy, Bruton, Colonel Ogden Bruton, somehow it's a US Army talk today, was also US Army, pediatrician. And he studied a young boy who was only 8 years old and who kept getting recurrent infections, nasty infections, pneumonias in fact mainly. He was found to basically have no natural antibodies. And later on they worked out that this disease, called agamma-globulinemia, which also means no antibodies, none of your own antibodies in the blood, was caused by that boy missing a thing called a tyrosine kinase, which is a protein in the body, and they named it after him. So that's why it's called Bruton's tyrosine kinase. Lacking that Bruton's tyrosine kinase genetically is a very bad thing, as you can see, causes lots and lots of infections. But these Bruton's tyrosine kinases are important, again, for the normal function of B cells and also for the normal functions of these guys, which I told you before might be sitting in that rim of the lesion, causing these pearls and cells. And you can inhibit this Bruton's tyrosine kinase with things called Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or BTKIs. And That is obviously not a complete inhibition. That would be dangerous because we don't want everyone to die from bad pneumonia. It's a partial inhibition, so reducing it. And there's actually two trials, I would say, that we're really eagerly awaiting, which are expected in 2025 or in early 2026 to read out. These are not being done by and large in Australia. So they all have better names. If they make it, they'll have better names than these. But for the moment, it's called tolebrutinib and fenebrutinib. This Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor is what that means. And we can see that these trials are being done in progressive MS as well, in secondary progressive and primary progressive MS. So 2025 is kind of a big year. We're going to know whether double dose Ocrevus can work in progressive MS, and we're going to know whether either of these drugs has an effect in progressive MS. So in summary, some MS lesions persist, not many, 10% maybe, with an iron rim. This marks a rim of immune cells still active and doing damage and creating things called cells, or slowly expanding lesions. These processes are important in progression and they involve both B cells and macrophages, and these are being targeted by several drugs in trials, as I've shown you. So there's more happening than for progressive MS than maybe people think. It's just not all happening in Australia. Remyelination, is there still hope? Yes, there is. But development for new remyelination drugs has largely stopped. And the reason is that it's too expensive. And I think, Nigel, you mentioned how we were actually trying to make these trials cheaper by using self-assessment tools. And in fact, we're still doing that. It's all about finding a way of translating the discoveries from the lab into clinical trials and into the clinic. And basically, the cells and pearls might be one answer, as I said before, because we could measure whether treatment just affects the cells, stops them from expanding, and then we can do the big trials in progressive MS. That strategy is called phase 2 to phase 3. A phase 2 trial is just trying to work out whether something might work in people with MS. It's not the definitive trial, which costs a lot of money and goes for a long time, and actually measures whether people stop progressing or might even get better. So these phase 2 trials are really, really important. They're trying to... I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a pharmaceutical company and you have a new drug that you think might reduce heart attacks or strokes, targeting, I don't know, blood pressure or cholesterol. Right? New drug for blood pressure or cholesterol. So what you're going to do is, first of all, you're going to try your new drug to see whether it actually lowers blood pressure or cholesterol. Right, so you give it to a few people and see what happens to their blood pressure or what happens to their cholesterol. But then you have to give it to 10,000 people to see if that actually reduces strokes and heart attacks. So the blood pressure or the cholesterol is the biomarker. It's easy to do. And for MS, for progressive MS, that's the bit we haven't had. Right, so a company has to either, like that Ocrevus trial, go directly to 900 people and spend about $500 million to $1 billion. That's a huge risk. Or not do it. What we want to do is say, here is a way of working out for $5 million or $10 million, which for these guys is peanuts, whether this drug might work. Right? So that's phase 2, and then you can invest the big bucks. So the other biomarker for progression, apart from cells, that we've been working on for a long time, is actually reaction time. That's something that you can do on your phone. So we have, some of you might have done these at some point in the past. And they're not very sexy pictures because, you know, it's academia. We don't have like the millions. But these are actually tests. Like it was actually originally programmed in Brazil. That's why soccer balls. But a soccer ball appears on the screen and you press a button. You can do it on your phone, right? Or you can have a red or black one and you have to select whether it's red or black. And the other one is actually, you see a whole set of playing cards and you have to say, is this the same card or different to the last one? Those 3 tests take about 4 minutes to do. And we're asking lots of people to do that about once a month. So 4 minutes once a month. And the reason is that we see these kind of things. This is somebody who's been doing these tests for 3 years. We've been working on some of this for a long time. And the first test, just pressing a button, is very quick. Making a choice, is it red or black, is slightly slower, and making a more complicated choice, is it the same or different, is slightly slower again. But here you see the typical time that it takes them to do it. And here's, of course, years that they've done this. And what we can see is that all 3 of these tests are super stable. Right, this person is not changing at all. Their reaction time is just staying exactly the same. And here's someone who looks the same, feels the same, but they're not actually stable. It kind of looks like it might be fairly stable, but if you look closely, you can actually see that each of these is slowly going up. So this is another way that we can look at worsening in hopefully a very quick way. So we think that this is another way of doing clinical trials in progressive MS, phase 2 clinical trials, literally just having people do that on their phone while they're either taking drug A or drug B or no drug, to see if we can see a signal. So how do we tie all that together? Another really big investment from MS Australia is I think you're getting the sense. You're getting the sense that one of the you're getting the sense that one of the big problems in MS research is actually trial design rather than the drugs. Like, we've got to get a way of making the trials faster, better, more efficient. And this is a really good idea. It comes out of England. It's called Octopus, which stands for something like optimizing treatment in MS with multiple arms or something. So the MS Australia has decided they're going to throw their lot in with, or we're going to throw our lot in with that, and create something in Australia called Platypus. Riffing on Octopus. And the idea of this thing is that that you're going to have some people who are going to take some sort of placebo, but rather than having a trial for drug A versus placebo, another trial versus drug B versus placebo, another trial here, another trial here, you actually just have one trial. One set of people take placebo for a period of time, and all the others can take all different kind of doses of or drugs at the same time. We think this is going to make trials about 50% faster and 50% cheaper. So these trials also coming. And the first 2 drugs that are going to be tried in that are probably not the most exciting drugs in the world. They may work, and they're selected for good reason. One of them is called metformin, a drug used for diabetes, and the other one is alpha-lipoic acid, a nutraceutical drug. If you look at the literature of that, you'll see that there's good reason to believe they might help in progressive MS. But I think the more important thing is that it establishes a platform. Right, so the MS Australia investment is helping to establish a platform in Australia so that it's another easy way for industry to say, hey, we've got this super cool drug, and we already have, like the system is already set up. All they have to do is add that drug into the pool, and people will start getting it, and we can see the signal. You can kind of see how much that speeds things up. So these things are called adaptive clinical trials. Again, Platypus is starting, my guess is in about November or November this year in many Australian sites. So in summary, new trial approaches in progressive MS will include measuring progression in new ways, imaging cells, and efficient trial platforms. I've got like 2 minutes left. This is all about getting older. So I'm going to... better than the alternative, as we say. And actually some probably advice for me, I'm getting older too, for all of us. So aging is actually an important cofactor in MS getting worse. Like as we get older, we have to exercise harder to keep what we have. And there's been I was just recently in a workshop in the US, which was actually all talking about all kinds of aspects of aging and MS treatments. And I looked up aging. Aging is really popular. People with MS, as you know, now have a normal life expectancy. So you're very, very, very unlikely to die from MS. So you'll die from whatever everyone else dies from. Cancer, strokes, heart attacks, old age. But as Western populations are aging really rapidly, so is our MS population. This was like a frightening slide. I just didn't realize this was such a big thing, aging. This is the population, this is the number of men, not women, but men over 80, as a proportion of all men. So in Japan, 8% of all men are now over 80. In Germany, it's 6%. In Australia, it's 3.5%. And this is growing rapidly. So when I'm 80, there'll be something like 20% of men be 80 or over. Why is that sort of important? The other thing that I discovered reading about this is really infection risks. We do know that one of the problems for MS drugs is that they can very slightly increase the risk of infection. But not a lot, a little bit. If it was a lot, they wouldn't be on the market, right? But as we age, it also markedly increases our risk of certain infections. And if we get older, we have MS, and we get a nasty infection, that might really create a huge setback. If you're in hospital or in intensive care for 2 or 3 weeks, you'll take a big hit. And we don't want that, right? So the infections which are increase rapidly in older people are pneumonia and urine infections. So if you're over 65, you're 3 times as likely, just anyone in the population, to get pneumonia than if you're under 65. And for viruses, most viruses are actually less common. But flu and getting shingles is more common. So my point here is that these things have vaccines. And I don't know what you think about COVID vaccines, but this is not about COVID vaccines, this is about other vaccines. So my final message for this talk, before we can discuss anything you like, just get yourself vaccinated. Pneumovax every 10 years, annual flu vax, and shingles vaccine. So there's now a non-live zoster vaccine that you should have over the age of 50. And the sad fact is that in Australia, only about half the people over 65 actually have had a pneumovax to try and prevent pneumonia and a flu vaccine in the last year. So certainly in our MS clinics, we're going to do a big audit and try and get everyone who wants to, it's obviously voluntary, but who wants to get vaccinated or at least not miss out on that vaccination. So that was my last message. Thank you very much for listening. This is our, missing our nurse here. There she is. So that's the amazing team at the Alfred, Caulfield, Sandringham, now Sale, working in MS. And we are one of the sites that's going to do all of those trials, but so are several others in Melbourne. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
I thought that we were short of the shingles vaccination at the moment. That's what the word was going around, that it's not as freely available as what.
That's possible, yeah. Do you want to? Yeah, I don't know that for sure, but we should definitely, when and if available, actually have it. Sorry, I think you were keen.
I have a comment about Shingrix.
Okay.
Last year I ended up in sort of waiting queue to get Shingrix because my understanding it doesn't contain live virus and I can take it, and I had clearance from my neurologist to do that.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
12 days before I ended up with shingles, and thankfully I found out about that it could be potentially that and managed to hit it in time so that I get antivirals, and that was all wonderful. Now the problem beyond that is that I needed to wait 12 months to get my Shingrix vaccination, because apparently according to the normal person has got 12 months of natural immunity in their system, and then after that you're eligible to Shingrix. 3 months down the track I ended up with shingles again. So my doctor said, look, there is nothing I can do, unfortunately, just onto the antivirals again. And then they rang me up and said, look, you need to speak with your neurologist because this is unusual, and they might have provide a dispensation to see if you can get Shingrix without having to wait 12 months. And that's what ultimately happened. My neurologist spoke with his infectious disease colleagues, and they gave me a dispensation, and I ended up with the Shingrix, and then the second dose about less than 2 months later, and I have not had the shingles since, and it's now been probably.
Well, I think that's all good advice for people to know about the. In general, of course, when you actually have shingles, you make a certain amount of certain immune response to that. It sounds like the right people advocated for you to solve that particular problem for you.
It was just awful, and I thought by exercise I'd do everything right, it would not happen to me. Immune system down.
Well, I mean, shingles happens to 1% of people a year over the age of 50. And then it goes up from that. So this is a pretty common thing and can be pretty nasty. Other questions? Yeah. Or comments? Thank you for your comment, by the way. I think that's helpful for people to know.
A question about your vitamin D study. I was just wondering, while it didn't show that there was disease reduction in multiple sclerosis activity, did you observe any other correlations like mood, fatigue levels, quality of life? Did you study for those things as well?
We're actually, the epidemiology people at University of Melbourne, led by Anne-Louise Ponsonby, are actually still looking into that. So we were looking at the headline results, which were all negative. But that is happening. Yeah. So the idea might be maybe it improves some other part, like fatigue or mood. Yeah. So.
I've got a question still about vitamin D. Is it good to take like 2,000 units per 2,000 units per day, or I can take like 10,000 units per week and that's it? Because I don't like take pills simply. The question is one big tablet per week do the job, or it's better to take every day?
I think that 10,000 a week is completely fine, and there's now more of these larger pills available. Because actually when you take vitamin D, or when it's made in the sun, it lasts in the body about 3 months, like 60 to 90 days. So,
thanks, Helmut. I had 2 questions, and I'll ask them both and let you answer them as you will. Given the data that people are living longer, in people with MS, I'm wondering if there's any discussion about lengthening or expanding the exclusion criteria in trials, which has been typically 65. So that's a question. And the other one is with the Ocrevus and treatments that attack, we're happily killing our B cells. Are there any ramifications with, I mean, they are part of our immune arsenal against viruses that are out there. So is that problematic at all?
So the first question is absolutely valid. Like, clinical trials are largely being done in people 18 to 55 and occasionally 18 to 60, and also at relatively lower levels of disability. Both of those boundaries are being pushed right now. So part of the workshop that I went to was actually to try and create a consensus statement to force pharmaceutical companies to expand the criteria for clinical trials, both in terms of disability level but also in terms of age. Huge problem in the past. And you might say, well, why do they do that? Well, they do that because they want their trials, basically the people in the trials, to get as few other diseases randomly as possible. Like, if you're 60, you know, you've got a chance that you might get a cancer in the next year or the next 2 years, including on the trial, and that's then a big problem for them to work out whether the drug caused it or whether it was just random. But I think these are sort of starting to turn into excuses because the population of people with MS is expanding upwards, and we should create some evidence as to how to treat them.
And I think people are living healthier.
Yeah. Yeah, we live much longer. I think even for men, the life expectancy in Australia is now 85 or even 86. For women, it's, I think, 3 years more than that. It's like the average age is starting to push 90. The second question you had is about side effects. That's why we need more trials and studies in older people, and this is also why I mentioned the thing about infections. We're pretty sure that some infections, like pneumonias and also urinary tract infections, can become more frequent with these drugs, like Ocrevus. And they also become much more frequent as we age. So it's a double whammy for thinking hard about anything preventative that we can do. And the simplest preventative thing we can do is vaccinate. Or be vaccinated.
Just had a question about when you said about the remyelination. So if you have regular MRIs and there's no, new lesions, some of my largest lesions look like they've shrunk, which is
good thing. Must be a good thing.
Yeah. Could they still have the iron rim?
So normally, the answer is it's quite unlikely.
Okay.
Mostly, the iron rim occurs in slowly expanding lesions. So if the lesions are getting small, if a particular lesion is getting smaller, it's very unlikely to have it. I think one of the things is that there's a lot of interest in this now. And the current MRI scanners do not usually have the sequences on them that can detect the iron rim. But I think it's going to change. So I think in the next year or two, more and more of the scans, if you're having scans, will actually include that sequence, because we definitely want to understand that better.
Question behind you.
Behind you?
Me.
Ah, you.
I've got one.
Next to me. Sorry.
I'm lucky enough to have just joined the over 80 group with MS.
It's popular. It's popular.
I've had MS for 50 years. I've never had many lesions, maybe half a dozen or something like that. I've rarely had new lesions, but I've continued to go steadily downhill. I've been on 3 or 4 different medications. And looking back at it, I don't think the medications have ever changed that rate.
What's happening to you, yeah. So I guess it's possible that if we looked at your scans over 20 years, that we could actually see that some of those lesions, perhaps in the spinal cord, are very slowly getting bigger. It's possible. That might be an explanation for it. And by and large, we don't have great treatments for progressive MS. In fact, the Ocrevus I showed you, it's a 25% slowing. How would you ever know if you were getting worse 25% slower or 25% faster than your imaginary twin who is not taking the drug? It's actually impossible, right? So this is only, and this is a conversation I struggle with a lot with my patients, is for you as an individual, we would never know. If I've got 300 of you, then I know that as a group, you're doing a bit better.
Yes,
but for you as a person, who knows? Of course, if drugs become magnificently effective, you would know because you would stop getting worse. And I guess that's the aim. And I suppose this is like a little step on that journey, is understanding perhaps how it happens, at least in some people better, and working out new ways of doing trials so that we can try lots of medications. And someone like you might be in a trial system and get different drugs over different time and be able to participate in lots of studies to see whether it will slow it down. And I think just because you're over 80, that doesn't mean that you should not have that opportunity if you want it.
Whilst being here, can I just ask you about artificial intelligence and what impact that may be having on trials? Is it able to detect things which previous systems haven't been able to detect, for example?
So artificial intelligence, when we are doing something, like the things that I showed you on the phone, or other tests, that, or even if you're scrolling on your phone, using your finger or typing, the phone can theoretically record lots and lots and lots of data. How fast are you typing, with what pressure are you typing, how accurately are you typing. And you could write one word and that the phone could potentially generate like 1,000 bits of data for a word that you type. Maybe not quite 1,000, but definitely over 100. So once you get into that sort of huge data, machine learning is almost the only way that we can sort that data out to work out what's actually potentially predicting you getting worse or not getting worse. Right? So machine learning is a technique fundamentally to reduce the complexity of big data. Like if I'm a you're a neurologist, and I do a neurological score, and I count your relapses, and I count your age. That's about 4 data points, and I don't need machine learning for that. But if you're in one of these device studies and you're actually generating 8,000 data points a day, the only way that I can handle that as a researcher is using machine learning or artificial intelligence, which is powered by artificial intelligence.
My question is, if you have MS and it's not terribly aggressive, one of the more mild ones, do you have a default age range where you wouldn't consider a medication like Ocrevus because of its effect on the immune system, more likely to get infection? I'm thinking of somewhere in 65, 70. Is that sort of age range? I'm taking a guess. I really wouldn't know.
Yeah, it's like it's a big. That's a big question, right? And the question is really, if my MS is milder, and probably as we age, actually the relapse side of things and new lesions gets much less anyway. How long do we need to take medication for, and what's the best medication for a scenario, which is actually, it's a risk-benefit problem, right? Like, what's the risk and what's the benefit of staying on this drug versus changing to another drug? And I don't want to dodge the question, but we're really trying to sort that out with big registries now.
There should be a range, though. I'm thinking 65 to 70. Would that range be something where you'd be posing a question mark?
Yes. Even younger, even 55, maybe. Posing the question mark, I like to rephrase as, that's a good research question. Right? Because the question mark, it's not an answer statement. It really depends so much on the individual circumstance. If you're 75 and you've just had a big attack or an attack of MS, which can happen, there's a very strong reason to be on a good medication. But most people aged 75 or more don't have attacks, right? So it's very much a personalized question, and the research methodology for sorting that out is to have data on lots of people. So in the registry, which I'm fortunate to have run for the last 20 years, called MS Base, we are now very carefully monitoring 45,000 people with MS all over the world to try and answer that question. Because some of them naturally will stop medication or change medication, some won't, and we can work out the benefit versus the risk. So where we hope to get to in 5 years, actually something that was funded recently by the Trish MS Foundation, there's a big research project to look at exactly that. What we have in medicine for many scenarios is what's called a risk score. As a man, you might get prostate cancer. And they will actually work out what's the best treatment for you, from no treatment at all, just observation, all the way to a very aggressive surgery, on the basis of a risk score called the Gleason score. Okay? So we don't have that for MS. But it would be nice to have a risk score to say, oh, in this person, it's actually very safe to stop treatment altogether. They're not going to get worse and will reduce their infections. In this person, probably a bad idea, because they had a much greater risk of getting worse and a lower risk of infection, right? So that's some of our research, very intensive research, is trying to answer exactly that question. But yes, the older we are, probably the less we need the drugs.
Excuse me, I've got a question. I've had MS since I was 29, and mine was very mild, obviously. When I got to 55, and I had medication, injections, whatever, and I had a lot of side effects, and I changed about 5 medications. When I got to about 55, my specialist took me off all medication and said, we've no proof that it fixes you or it doesn't fix you, but the side effects are worse. And now I'm 70 and I'm just getting worse slowly. So taking me off the medication I was shocked with, but I felt better.
Well, to be honest, that you're now 70.
Just told you my age.
So in retrospect, for you personally, that's probably a good decision, right? For another person at 55, that could have been a disastrous decision. And the only way we're going to sort that out is if lots of people like you are in a registry and we can observe what happens and we can work out, as I said, a risk score. So your doctor's hunch in this particular situation was perfect. But, you know, hunches are not always perfect. I think I've exhausted the room almost.
Couple of things. Going back to EBV,
Yeah.
theoretically, if you are to find the way to switch off the virus, dormant virus that lives at the end of nerve cells somewhere in spine, brain, God knows where, and kill that off, wouldn't that be almost like a great solution for a whole range of autoimmune things, because it does seem to play some kind of link in it, including MS and Parkinson's and God knows what.
So that's the, I'll say $1 million question, but I would change it to $10 billion question. Because we have very strong evidence from that American study for MS that it's kind of almost required for you to have EBV to get MS. We have absolutely no idea at this point whether it's involved in the disease after that. Is it just involved in the causation, or is it also involved in the progression or the activity, and we don't know. I guess the trial that I showed is trying to answer that by giving people an antiviral medication. It's far from perfect because we don't have really good antiviral medications for EBV yet. We have some that work a bit. So that's what they're trying to do with that trial, is to see a signal whether suppressing EBV can either reduce fatigue levels or reduce progression.
And the second unrelated question is about remyelination and why do lesions disappear? Is it because of it?
So they're not actually necessarily related. The first question, remyelination, is a normal phenomenon in the body. But most lesions, in early MS especially, remyelinate. So the myelin sheath can repair itself. It does it less and less efficiently. The more it has to do it, the more lesions we get and the older we get. It can also be augmented, right? So even though it's a natural thing, it's something your body does naturally, we know that certain drugs can make it better, can create more remyelination. Like, we know that for sure. Unfortunately, none of the drugs that have been tried so far have been strong enough to make a big difference to people with MS, to actually improve them. So we can see, for example, that if we test the eye in someone who's had optic neuritis, eye nerve inflammation, that eye nerve will be a bit slower at transmitting the signal, right? So your vision is actually in the back of your head. The so-called occipital cortex has to go from the eye to the back. And actually you can measure that. You can give people a flash of light into their eye, and you can measure how quickly or how slowly it gets to the back of the head. And typically it's about 110 milliseconds. Right? And if you've had optic neuritis in one eye, it might be as slow as 130 or 140 milliseconds or slower. And if we give, this is another biomarker example, if we give the drugs, we can actually see that getting faster. So in somebody who's had, optic neuritis 10 years ago, we can, with some drugs, new myelin can grow, and we know that, so the proof of principle is definitely true. The ones that have been tried so far just haven't been strong enough to make a significant difference to actual function. Right? Because it doesn't really matter whether that number is 120 or 130 milliseconds if you can't see any better. Right? But this is again that strategy that I talked about, the phase 2, the biomarker is actually the conduction speed in the eye nerve. So when people are doing that, they're saying, oh, this works. Let's try it in a big study. Sadly, that big study has an antibody called opicinumab or anti-lingo that I talked about a lot before. Didn't work. Didn't work well enough. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, when with RRMS, when somebody's having a relapse, do they redo the Epstein-Barr titer to see whether it's increased? Because when they're initially diagnosed, they do a titer, yes, you've had it. Mm-hmm. Would that be a way of measuring whether, like chickenpox, it becomes shingles, so you can see that it's so you've got a visual. But if you redid the titer for the Epstein-Barr, if it increased in that time of relapsing, would that be an indication that the Epstein-Barr virus is actually in and out of being active within the body?
It absolutely would be. And I'm on slightly shaky ground here, but I think it's been done in a variety of ways and it hasn't shown that. Okay. You can also, so measuring the titer is actually measuring the antibody response to the virus. You can actually also even measure the virus itself, like the virus DNA or genetic material. And I think that's even been done in the spinal fluid. Closer to the action, so to speak, than from the blood. And I think those studies have been negative, but I'm on please don't tape this, I'm on slightly shaky ground there, yeah. But that still doesn't mean that it couldn't, because those studies are actually hard to do, right? It doesn't You're right, if we got a positive answer, it would be a very strong indication that EBV is directly involved. But it's like the fact that if the studies don't show that, it doesn't mean it's not, because it's actually hard to measure. So the research should be ongoing with that, yeah.
Well, Helmut's done a fantastic job as usual. And has not only given us something to think about, but has told us something about what we might look forward to. And I think the stuff about EBV is one of the most exciting elements. There's actually something there which 100% of people with MS show signs of EBV antibodies. But the other things that Helmut's talked about are brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So John,
oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again.